If you're watching this, take a second to breathe with me. This story starts with loss, but it ends with truth. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and stay with me until the end. Because some secrets are kept not out of cruelty, but out of love. This is one of them. The day we buried my husband, the sky didn't cry the way I expected it to. No rain, no thunder. Just a dull, unmoving gray, stretched thin over the cemetery like an exhausted sigh. People say the world stops when you lose someone you love, but that isn't true. Cars still passed on the road nearby. Birds still argued in the trees. Even the gravediggers joked quietly while waiting for the service to end. The world didn't stop. Mine did. I stood there in my black coat, my hands clasped so tightly that my fingers went numb. 37 years of marriage reduced to a polished wooden box lowered into the ground. Harold had always hated funerals. He once told me, half smiling, that if he ever had one, he hoped people would be bored enough to leave early. I almost laughed thinking about it. Almost. Our son, Daniel, stood on my right. He was tall now, taller than his father had ever been, with the same dark eyes, but none of the softness. Grief had hardened him, I could see that clearly. He stared at the coffin like it had personally betrayed him. He hadn't cried, not once. When people hugged him, he stiffened. When they offered condolences, he nodded politely like a stranger accepting apologies for a delayed flight. I wanted to reach for his hand. I didn't. Something between us had changed years ago, long before the funeral. It wasn't anger exactly. It was distance. The kind that grows quietly, like weeds between stones, until one day you realize the path is no longer walkable. When the service ended, Daniel leaned toward me and said, "I'll take care of the paperwork. Bank stuff, insurance, whatever needs to be done." His voice was steady, controlled. "Thank you," I said. That was it. No hug. No shared tears. He walked away to speak with the funeral director while I stood alone beside the fresh mound of earth, listening to the sound of dirt hitting wood in my memory. That night, I slept in the guest room. I couldn't bring myself to lie in our bed, not yet. The house felt wrong without Harold's breathing beside me, his habit of clearing his throat before sleep, the way he always stole the blankets. Instead, I lay staring at the ceiling fan, counting rotations, until the sun crept through the curtains. The next morning, the lawyer called. "Mrs. Whitman," he said gently, as if his tone alone could soften what was coming. "We'll need to schedule a time to go over your husband's will." Daniel insisted on coming with me. We sat in silence the entire way, the kind that presses against your ears. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. Harold had used the same man for years, trusted him. That should have comforted me. It didn't. The will was straightforward at first. The house, the savings, a few investments. Daniel listened carefully, his jaw tight, nodding occasionally. Then the lawyer cleared his throat. "There is one additional property," he said, sliding a thin folder across the desk toward me. "A cabin," he continued. "In northern Montana." Daniel turned to look at me surprised. "A cabin?" I felt my heart stutter. Harold and I talked about that cabin only in whispers late at night when regrets felt heavier than sleep. "Yes," I said quietly. The lawyer explained that the cabin was left solely to me, not jointly, not to Daniel, just me. Daniel frowned. Why didn't I know about this? I met his eyes and saw something dangerous there, not curiosity, but calculation. "It was your father's," I said. "Before we were married." The lawyer added, "Your father specified that the cabin remain private. His exact words were, 'Let it be a place of quiet.'" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said, exhaling sharply, "we should sell it." The word hit me like a slap. "Sell it?" I repeated. "Yeah," he said, already nodding to himself. "Remote property, upkeep costs, taxes. Doesn't make sense to keep it. Especially now." I looked at the folder again. The address typed neatly on the front. The place where Harold had gone alone for weeks at a time, claiming it was for fishing or clearing his head. The place I had visited only once and never forgotten. "I'm not ready to decide," I said. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Mom, you don't need another responsibility. You have enough on your plate." The lawyer cleared his throat again, suddenly fascinated by his pen. "I'll think about it," I said, more firmly this time. Daniel didn't argue, but something shifted in the room. A quiet tension settled between us, unspoken but heavy. That night, after Daniel left, I opened the folder alone. When Harold passed, his lawyer handed me a small, unassuming box. Inside was a map, a key, and a handwritten note in Harold's familiar slanted script. It simply said, "You'll know when it's time." I cried then. Not the loud, dramatic sobs you see in movies. Just silent tears slipping down my face as I pressed that note to my chest. It felt like his last whispered secret. I didn't tell my son Daniel about the note or the key. In the weeks that followed, he called often, too often. "Did you talk to a realtor about the house? Did you get the tax assessment back? Mom, cabins like that are worth a lot these days." Each time I'd deflect, change the subject, or claim I was too tired to talk. He was getting pushy and it felt wrong. Then he started stopping by unannounced. He'd rummage through drawers, asking about documents. One afternoon, I caught him going through the filing cabinet in the study. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Just helping, Mom," he said, but he couldn't meet my eyes. His gaze darted away, guilty. That was the moment I decided. I wouldn't tell him about the cabin. Not about what Harold had hidden there, and definitely not about what I suspected Daniel was already looking for. He wasn't helping, he was searching. 3 months after the funeral, I knew it was time. I packed a small bag and drove to Montana alone. The road stretched out before me, long and empty, like a confession waiting to be heard. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the air became cleaner, thinner. My chest ached, but in a good way, like a long-held breath finally being released. The cabin stood exactly as I remembered it. Weathered wood, a stone chimney, all surrounded by tall pines that whispered secrets even when the wind was still. My hands trembled as I used the key. The door creaked open, and the scent of pine, dust, and memory washed over me. It was like stepping back in time. Harold's boots were still by the door, his old fishing rod propped against the wall. I ran my fingers over the small notches carved into the kitchen table years maybe. Or regrets. I moved slowly through the space, touching things as if they might disappear, and then I saw it. A door I'd never noticed before. It wasn't the bathroom or the bedroom. It was a narrow wooden door at the back of the cabin, partially hidden behind a heavy bookshelf. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Harold had never shown me this. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed the bookshelf aside. The hinges groaned as I pulled the door open, revealing a small windowless room. Inside was just a desk, a sturdy metal box, and stacks upon stacks of notebooks. My legs suddenly felt weak, and I sank into the chair. The notebooks were filled with Harold's handwriting, dates, names, bank account numbers, and letters. So many letters, all addressed to Daniel. Letters that were never sent. My hand shook as I picked one up and began to read. And in that dusty, hidden room, I finally understood everything. I understood why Harold had been so distant near the end. Why he'd insisted the cabin remain private, a place just for us. And why, for the first time since his death, a profound sense of gratitude washed over me that I had kept his secret. That I had kept quiet. The truth was safe here, and so was Harold's legacy. I couldn't finish the first letter in one sitting. My eyes blurred halfway through, not just from tears but from the weight of what Harold had carried alone. I folded the pages carefully, as if rough handling might somehow disrespect his silence, and set them back on the desk. The cabin creaked softly around me, settling into the evening the way an old body does when it finds a familiar chair. I stayed there that night. I made a small fire, cooked canned soup Harold had left behind, and slept on the narrow bed wrapped in a quilt that still smelled faintly of his cologne. I dreamed of him standing at the edge of the trees, watching me, not waving, not calling my name, just waiting. In the morning, sunlight cut through the pines and spilled across the wooden floor. I made coffee and sat at the desk again. This time I opened the metal box. Inside were documents I didn't fully understand at first. Old contracts. Copies of checks, legal correspondence spanning nearly 20 years. And beneath it all, another bundle of letters, these addressed to me. My name written in Harold's hand felt like a bruise reopening. I read them slowly, one by one. He wrote about guilt. About mistakes made when Daniel was young. About money borrowed and never returned. About trusting the wrong people and worse, teaching our son to do the same without meaning to. Harold had designed loans for Daniel's early business ventures. All of them failed. Harold paid quietly. Again and again, until he couldn't anymore. One letter made my hand shake. Daniel hadn't just failed. He'd lied, forged signatures, moved funds, taken advantage of his father's need to protect him. Harold discovered it too late when the amounts were already staggering. Enough to threaten our retirement. Enough to make Harold sick with worry long before the cancer did its work. The cabin wasn't just an escape. It was a safeguard. Harold had moved what little he could legally protect into accounts tied to the cabin, slowly, carefully, with legal guidance. Not to punish Daniel, but to ensure I wouldn't be left with nothing when the truth finally surfaced. Because Harold knew it would. He wrote, "Our son is not evil. He is weak where he should be strong, and he will look for what he believes is his." I pressed my palm flat against the desk, breathing hard. Daniel had been circling me since the funeral like a man searching for loose floorboards. By the third day, I finished all the letters. I understood why Harold never sent them. Some truths, once spoken, cannot be taken back. And Harold had loved Daniel too much to destroy what little balance remained. I packed the letters carefully and hid them beneath the floorboard under the bed. Then I locked the cabin and drove home. Daniel was waiting for me. My driveway, once empty and peaceful, was now occupied by his car. He stood on the porch when I pulled in, arms crossed, face tight with something that looked like concern, but wasn't. "Where were you?" he asked. "I took a few days," I said calmly. "I needed space. You didn't answer your phone." "I didn't want to." He followed me inside, his eyes scanning the house like it might suddenly confess something. "You went to the cabin, didn't you?" I didn't answer right away. I set my keys down. Took off my coat. "Yes," I said. His jaw clenched. "You said you weren't ready." "I didn't say I wouldn't go." "You should have told me." I turned to face him then, really face him. "Why?" He opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "Because I'm your son." "And I'm your mother," I replied. "Not your secretary, not your banker." His eyes flashed. "That cabin is family property." "No," I said quietly. "It isn't." Something broke in his expression then, not sadness. Not grief, anger. First, it was the letters from banks. They were asking about accounts I'd never heard of, all addressed to my late husband, Harold. Then came a notice from the county, a request for a property inspection that my son, Daniel, had submitted without my consent. A few days later, a strange man showed up at my door. He called himself a financial advisor and started asking very specific questions about Harold's estate. It became clear very quickly that Daniel wasn't grieving anymore. He was hunting. One afternoon, he showed up again, unannounced, clutching a thick folder. "I talked to a lawyer," he said, walking right past me into the living room as if he still lived here. "Turns out wills can be contested, especially if there was." Concealment. My heart didn't race. It didn't pound. It just settled, heavy and cold in my chest. "Concealment of what, Daniel?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. "Assets," he said, his eyes darting around the room. "Dad wasn't always transparent." I couldn't help but smile then. It was a small, sad smile. "You sound just like him," I said softly. He scoffed, dismissing my words. "You think you're protecting something, Mom, but you're not. You're just delaying the inevitable." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so he would have to lean in to hear me. "You have no idea what you're talking about." He leaned in, his face inches from mine. "I know there's more," he hissed. "And I'll find it." That night, for the first time in 37 years of living in this house, I locked my bedroom door. A week later, my lawyer called. "Mrs. Whitman," she began, her tone professional but concerned, "your son has filed a preliminary inquiry. He's claiming there are undisclosed assets tied to a property in Montana." I closed my eyes, picturing the quiet cabin Harold had loved so much. "I expected that," I said calmly. "What would you like to do?" she asked. I thought of Harold's letters, the ones he left just for me. His careful planning, his last wish that I would be stronger than he had been at the end. "I want to be prepared," I said. She paused. "Prepared for what?" "For the truth," I replied. "When it finally comes out, because it always does one way or another." The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Daniel arrived one evening looking wild-eyed, the mask of calm he usually wore completely shattered. "They froze my accounts," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and panic. I stayed silent, just looking at him. "They're investigating transactions from years ago," he continued, pacing the floor. "They're asking about Dad." Still, I said nothing. He stopped pacing and stared at me, his eyes wide with dawning horror. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew all along, didn't you?" I met his gaze, my own steady and unflinching. Yes, I said. His face crumpled then, not with remorse, but with pure, selfish fear. You let me walk right into this, he accused, his voice hoarse. No, I corrected him gently. You walked yourself into it. He sank onto the couch, his hands shaking uncontrollably. I needed it, he pleaded. I was going to fix everything. I always meant to. I sat across from him, the distance between us feeling like a canyon. Your father paid your debts for 20 years, Daniel, I said softly. He protected you until the stress of it finally killed him. Daniel sobbed then. Loud, ugly, real sobs of a man who had finally hit rock bottom. But even as he cried, I knew with absolute certainty that I had done the right thing. If I had told him about the cabin, if I had shown him Harold's final letters, he would have destroyed them. He would have sold that last piece of his father's soul without a second thought. And in doing so, he would have taken the very last thing Harold left for me. Peace. For weeks after that night, Daniel was just gone. No calls, no texts, just this heavy, unfamiliar silence. I tried to convince myself it was a relief, but that was a lie. It was grief, piled on top of more grief. Losing a husband feels like losing the ground beneath your feet. Losing a child, even for a little while, feels like you've lost your own reflection in the mirror. The investigation started quietly, but soon it got louder. Official letters started arriving. Questions were asked. Names from my husband Harold's notebooks began to pop up in conversations I was never supposed to overhear. Daniel's old business partner, a loan officer who'd retired suspiciously early. A signature expert. Each new piece of information felt like a thread being pulled, unraveling the story Harold had tried so hard to keep together. I cooperated with everything, but I was careful. I answered only what they asked, and I answered honestly. I didn't mention the letters from Harold, and I definitely didn't mention the cabin. My lawyer told me I was doing the right thing, but sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Every night I dreamed of the cabin. Sometimes it was on fire. Other times it was buried under so much snow I couldn't get to the door. Once I dreamed Daniel was outside, screaming my name while I sat inside, completely frozen, unable to move. The dreams finally stopped the day I drove back to Montana. I hadn't planned on going, but it was like something was pulling me there. I packed a small bag and just drove, watching the road get narrower and the air turn crisp and sharp. The cabin felt like an old friend, welcoming me without any questions. I lit a fire, swept the floor, and sat at that old wooden desk. This time, I didn't reach for the notebooks. I opened the last letter Harold had ever written to me. I'd save it because I was afraid of what it would say, what it might ask of me. He wrote about forgiveness. Not the kind that makes excuses, but the kind that sets you free. He wrote that loving someone doesn't always mean saving them. Sometimes it means stepping aside and letting life teach the lessons you never could. And then I read a sentence that made me catch my breath. He wrote, if Daniel ever learns about this place, it will be because you decided he was ready, not before. If that day never comes, that's all right too. You've already done enough. I folded the letter and just held it. That was the night I finally knew what I had to do. 3 months later, the investigation was over. Daniel took a settlement. It kept him out of prison, but it cost him almost everything else, his reputation, his savings, his future. He moved away. I heard through a relative that he was doing construction work in Arizona. Hard labor for honest pay. Maybe the first honest thing he'd done in years. He didn't contact me, and I didn't contact him. People asked questions, of course. Friends, neighbors, even family. They wanted to know why my only son had just disappeared from my life. I'd just tell them, sometimes love looks like distance. A year went by. On the anniversary of Harold's death, I went to the cemetery alone with some flowers. I stood there, listening to the wind, and I told him everything. I told him about Daniel, about the cabin, and about how lonely the house still was. I did what I thought was right, I whispered. I hope that was enough. That night, there was a letter in my mailbox. It was Daniel's handwriting. My hand shook as I opened it. He didn't apologize right away. He wrote about the desert, the heat, and how strange it felt to be so physically exhausted that he could finally sleep without dreaming. He wrote about learning to live with less. And near the end, he said, I think Dad knew who I was before I did. I think he was trying to save you from me. I don't know if I can forgive myself yet, but I'm trying. There was no request for money, no demands. Just one last line. If you ever want to see me, I'd like that. I sat with that letter for a long, long time. Then I went to the cabin one last time. I packed up all the notebooks and letters and put them in a safe deposit box. I cleaned the cabin, made some repairs, and sat on the porch watching the sunset. For the first time, it didn't feel like a secret. It felt like a gift. When I finally wrote back to Daniel, my letter was short. I told him I was proud of the work he was doing and glad he was finding his way. I wrote, "When you're ready to talk not about the past, but about who you are now, I'll be here." I didn't mention the cabin. I didn't mention the letters. Some truths are earned, not inherited. It was a philosophy I'd come to live by, a quiet creed forged in the crucible of loss and misunderstanding. The silence wasn't a wall. It was a space, a garden where something fragile could grow. Months later, Daniel came to visit. The knock on the door was hesitant, so different from the angry pounding I remembered. When I opened it, I saw a changed man. He looked older not just in years, but in experience. The youthful roundness of his face had given way to a leaner, more defined structure. But it was his eyes that struck me the most. The hardness was gone, replaced by a softness, a vulnerability I hadn't seen since he was a little boy. We sat across from each other at the same dining table where he had once hurled accusations at me, his words like stones. The ghosts of that fight lingered in the air, but they were fainter now, their power diminished. He broke the silence first, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "I don't expect anything," he said, his gaze fixed on the wood grain of the table. "I just wanted to see you, and in that simple admission a dam broke within me. It was enough. More than enough." We didn't dive into the deep, turbulent waters of our past. Instead, we waded in the shallows. We talked about small, ordinary things. The unseasonably warm weather. The leaky faucet in the kitchen I still hadn't fixed. His new project at work. The conversation was a delicate dance, a careful choreography of avoidance and connection. We didn't talk about Harold. Not yet. The wound was still too fresh, the name too heavy to be spoken aloud. But his absence was a silent third person at the table, a presence we both acknowledged without words. It was progress. When it was time for him to leave, he stood by the door for a moment. Then he stepped forward and hugged me. Not the stiff, obligatory embrace of holidays past, but a real hug. An embrace that conveyed apology, forgiveness, and a shared, unspoken grief. I felt the tension in his shoulders, the years of anger and resentment finally begin to melt away. He held on for a long moment, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, it didn't feel like a duty. It felt like coming home. After his car disappeared down the street, the silence of the house settled around me. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was peaceful, not empty. I walked into my bedroom and pulled open the top drawer of my nightstand. Tucked away beneath a stack of old photographs was the key to the cabin. I picked it up, its cold metal warming quickly in my palm. The weight of it was familiar, a tangible link to a past I had kept secret. I held it, turning it over and over, feeling the smooth edges. Someday, maybe I would tell him everything. Someday, maybe I would drive him up that winding mountain road and let the whispering pines and the quiet lake do the talking. I'd let him discover the letters for himself, let him piece together the truth in his own time. But not yet. I realized then that keeping quiet had never been about hiding something from my son. It had been about protecting the last embers of goodness, shielding them from the harsh winds of grief until they had a chance to rekindle into a steady flame. And standing there with the key in my hand and the warmth of my son's hug still lingering, I was glad. So very glad I had kept quiet.